I'm Tracey Masella, a licensed clinical social worker for the Adolescent Transitional Living Program at Silver Hill Hospital in New Canaan. Welcome to the first episode of Straight Talk with Tracey. Each month we'll be discussing mental health issues with experts at Silver Hill Hospital, answering your questions, and getting the conversation going on mental health and addiction. This month, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Erin Krasner, the Adolescent Transitional Living Service Chief at Silver Hill Hospital. This month, we're going to be talking about knowing if your kid is all right. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be here, Tracey. Thank you so much for having me.
So, we've done a lot of work together at Silver Hill Hospital with the adolescents in our program, aged 13 to 17, 18 years old. We've encountered a lot of different experiences. What I wanted to talk about today is how do you know, how does a parent know, how does a clinician in the community know, how does a teacher know, how does a school social worker know if the kid is all right? So what is adolescent behavior, what's normative adolescent behavior, and what might be a sign of something more?
Well, I think it's a very important question. It's a public health question. It's a practical question, and the line between what is normative and what is not normative in teens can be quite blurry. There are, however, a couple of really important benchmarks that over the years we have found to be important determinants of normative, quote-unquote, adolescent function.
Right, because there's no normal kids, right?
Not that have you met one?
I've not met one.
Yeah, me neither. Normative adolescent behavior includes going to school. And within someone's cognitive capacity, functioning at a level that is kind of within the umbrella of what they are capable of doing. Another normative thing that teens do is they start to separate a little bit from their parents, and they start to form new groups of peers who begin to play important roles in their lives. And that's why teens often go through a phase of separation with their parents that's painful for parents, and some parents can experience that as quote-unquote not normative. My son is always calling and out and doing da-da-da, and that's really within the, in the tent, so to speak, of normative. Normative is puberty, raging hormones, massive changes to the body and to the mind.
What's happening? That's a good point. What's happening in the adolescent brain? Because as we know, brain is not fully developed until about 24, 25 years old, right? So even normative adolescent behavior can often seem irrational, impulsive, because of what's happening in the brain. Is that right?
That's exactly right. There's a lot of very interesting science around the way the teen brain develops. And to summarize it, it's patchy. So the biomechanics of it are the neurons in the brain are sheathed with something called myelin. And this myelination process really does go until about 25. And myelin makes neurotransmissions smooth and makes neuronal connections effective. And when brains are not fully myelinated, or myelinated more or less in various parts of the brain, you can have patchy development in terms of brain signaling, the very basics of how thoughts and emotions are formed. So it is the rule, not the exception, that adolescents in some areas are going to demonstrate fluid, competent, brain activity and behavior, and pursuant behavior. and some areas that seem wackadoo.
And it's not consistent. So one day it's like they learned something and they've mastered that, and then the next day it's as if they've completely forgotten how to do that.
That's right. So there are kind of neurobiological underpinnings for this inconsistency that we see in teens all the time. In particular, the myelination of the prefrontal cortices, which is this part of the brain, is patchy in adolescence. And this is the part of the brain responsible for organization, planning, judgment, and that the fact that this part of the brain isn't fully myelinated makes for hazards.
So like when I say to my kid, what exactly were you thinking when you did that? And he says, I don't know.
He really doesn't know.
He really doesn't know, right? There was just not something happening that was discernible at that point. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course that's normative in pathological states. That kind of moment that you have described with your son can be dangerous. So making a decision to use drugs or alcohol or other kinds of reckless teenage behavior for some of the kids who have psychopathology is more pronounced and more dangerous and scary. And so that brings us to some of the markers of what could be signs that there are problems in adolescent development. The first one I said was school, right? Well, think of all that goes into being a student.
Especially today.
Especially
in
today.
the communities that we live in.
In these communities. The pressure is intense.
Exactly.
What goes into being a student? Well, you got to be organized to get up and go, which sounds basic, but for those of us who work with teens or have teens, the executive function required in just getting to school can be complicated and tricky. Then you have to be able to regulate self-esteem and fears, normative fears. Then you have to be able to sustain attention and take notes in class. Then you have to navigate the social world. Then you have to navigate some of the pressures. Then you have to navigate some of the extracurriculars, which are very important to some kids, but also can be very stressful. Then you have to navigate getting your homework done. All of those steps require
sleeping, eating, all those. Having relationships.
They all require so many high-level functions. So when one or more areas of adolescent mental function are impaired by psychological or psychiatric problems, then it's easy to see that attendance at school, a function at school, would be a very sensitive barometer for psychopathology. So teachers and parents are really at the front lines to begin to discern whether or not there's a problem. And the beginnings of problems are subtle.
Yeah.
We have treated over the years many families, and as you and I both know, it's the rule, not the exception, that parents are a little bit surprised about the seemingly sudden onset of problems. And when we go back carefully through the history, there were little warning shots that were hard maybe to discern in the moment, and in retrospect were represent a very clear trajectory towards psychopathology.
Right. So we very often see the mom or the dad, even the school, saying, well, they're a straight A student, right? They're taking 5 AP classes. They've got a 4.8 grade point average. Who knew you could get above a 4.0? Now you can, right? So that stake is even higher. if there's performance in one area, and usually that's academic, that's a kind of a shield for anything that might be going on behind that.
Yeah, and that's in particular true for kids who have a natural endowment of intelligence.
Right.
Where they can sort of hide behind their academic function and say, Mom, Dad, I'm getting good grades.
Right.
And the emotional piece can be confused or harder to discern. And teens, because they're separating from their parents, may not be inclined to share what's going on emotionally behind that screen of academic performance.
What's the fear of sharing that?
Well, that speaks to the societal taboos around mental illness. One first thought I have is a lot of parents struggle with depression and anxiety. And a lot of teens that we meet don't want to make matters worse for their parents.
So there's a guilt.
There is a guilt. Another thing is generational differences. I just had to ask one of our trusted staff to turn off my iPhone because I did not know how to do it.
I hear you.
So if I don't even know how to turn off my iPhone, these kids are Snapchatting, zip-zap duping,
flicking,
flonging.
Right.
And so it's just a different world to be a teenager as compared to what we grew up with. I told my kid the other day that I didn't have a cell phone when I grew up, and he was like appalled.
Right. How did you exist? How did you get anything done?
In fact, I think he was kind of insulted.
So that gets into the you don't understand.
Correct. So you don't understand.
How could they? How could you?
Right. My friends get it.
Right.
And
you don't know how hard it is, so why would I tell you?
Yeah.
You'll be dismissive.
Yeah. And there are other impairments around communication. In some of our communities, our homes are like little castles, and we're very separate from the rest of the people, even in our community. And so there's less kind of a back and forth and less engagement with community. And the old trope, it takes a village to raise a child, is imperiled by what has evolved in some parts of the country where people live in their own little fiefdoms. And that can be quite isolating for families, and in particular for kids in families who are struggling.
Right. There's such a sense of competition, not only among the kids, but among the parents, that there's a small number of elite spots in any given community, if you will, any school, any sport, any college, that everybody is competing for. And so if you show the chinks in the armor to the community, you're prey. Right?
That is correct. And unfortunately, when we forget this sometimes, we humans are animals. And we're fighting for resources, and we're fighting for survival. And that takes a toll on parents and families. And when teens within that matrix are struggling, it can be hard for teens to speak up and for parents to see it.
Right. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some early warning signs in childhood that might be reason for concern.
For 1 in 4 Americans, mental illness hits close to home. And since 1931, Silver Hill Hospital has also been close to home. For individuals and families facing the challenges of mental illness, Silver Hill offers a highly trained, compassionate staff that provides state-of-the-art care in a beautiful and private setting. If mental health issues hit close to home, remember, there's a world-class psychiatric hospital right in the neighborhood.
Let's go back a little bit. You were saying that there might be some early signs. So little itty bitty kids, right?
Yeah.
Starting in school, when we do a developmental history with the kids that we work with, we start way back in preschool, right? And we ask questions. What was it like socially, academically? How were they at home? And so what are the signs that we're looking for? What are some of the hallmarks of perhaps an anxious kid?
Yeah. Great question. There are a couple real big ones. Number one is separation anxiety. So when it's hard for Jimmy at 3, 4, 5 to say goodbye to mom or dad, and there's a prolonged separation and painful separation experience in kinder and pre-K, that's a small indication that there's some separation anxiety. Let me be specific about what that
Right. What does it look like?
Yeah.
Is this the kid clinging to the leg?
It's the kid clinging to the leg every day. Mm-hmm. It's the kid who won't get out of the car to go to school. And it's the mom and the dad who's sitting in the classroom for a couple hours in the morning, late to work. And you can see already a worry that can then be kind of grown and flourish into kind of an anxious attachment, where the child is anxious and can't separate, and the mother or father feels real anxious and has trouble kind of forcing the separation. Because all kinds of feelings abound around that, so parents are then late for work. Well, that has real implications. And the child struggles then to incorporate into the goings-on in pre-K or in kindergarten. So separation anxiety, and this is reflected in the literature, is a strong predictor of anxiety disorders in adolescence and in young adulthood. Obviously, signs and symptoms of developmental delays, not meeting milestones, etc. That's a very important early indicator of a problem that needs to be vetted with a pediatrician. And other kinds of behavioral problems where kids are interpersonally really, really struggling, and you're getting, as a parent, feedback from the school that there are problems interpersonally. All these things are indicators that there may be a problem that merit investigation. And we have seen cases over the years where parents have been incredibly diligent in getting the kind of help that is required, and that does not necessarily stem the tide of what is to come. And one might imagine that there are even more parents who have been diligent, who have been able to stem the tide with early detection. Early detection is obviously an important preventative measure for the development of psychopathology. And then we wouldn't see those kids because they would have gotten the help that they needed in a timely fashion. Around 9, 10, 11, you're going to see another warning sign that we see around that time, a real uptick in interpersonal problems, changes in friend groups, feelings of isolation, and complaints to the parents from the kid that things don't feel right at school. The next major wave happens with the onset of puberty, and that's when we start to see depressive and anxious states. There's more isolation in states of where there's a genetic predisposition for depression. We will see more concrete evidence of depression. And in early teens, that's irritability, ruptures, again, in interpersonal relationships, fighting with parents, difficulty accepting no from parents. And also, in that intervening period, I forgot to mention, another big warning sign is difficulty paying attention at school, which also is something that can be intervened upon.
So again, all of the things that you're talking about, irritability, difficulty accepting no, ruptures in friend groups, that all might be adolescence.
Yep.
So when is that on the spectrum of behavior? What would a rupture in relationships, for instance, look like, or a change in friend group? Very often when kids move from middle school to high school, they will start a whole new friend group because sometimes they're exposed to a larger pool of kids, right? And they find a different group of kids. So when would that be normative, and when would that be, this is more than normal?
I think you just put your finger on the pulse of it. When would it be more? It's really an issue of quantity and quality. So if the quality of the ruptures are abrupt and frightening for the child, then that's something. And if there are repeated ruptures and it becomes a pattern, then that's also highly, highly significant.
So if they can't kind of sustain relationships, even if they have different activities.
There you go.
Okay. One of the other things that you mentioned is isolation, right? So that's often hard to discern because, as you mentioned earlier, kids are moving away from parents as being their kind of go-to to a peer group. That's normative, right? That they're trying to answer the question, who am I?
Right.
And that is reflected more in adolescence by their peers than by their parents. So they want to spend more time alone in their room because they're doing, they're connecting, and nowadays they're connecting via technology more and more, and they want to be away from the parents. So again, when is isolation versus just hanging out in your room and Snapchatting with your friends?
Well, I suppose you know it when you see it. When someone is retreating and retreating and retreating and avoiding and avoiding and avoiding, and it's accompanied by failures at school and interpersonal, we're starting to depict now a syndrome where these various points are now connected on a line.
So impairment in multiple areas of a kid's life. Not just school, not just relationships, not just at home, not just with the family.
Yep. And I love your use of the word impairment. It really captures it. When the maladaptive coping strategies derail normative development and the normative flow of what's going on in a home or what's going on at school, there's a problem. And your threshold for seeking help or seeking a consultation should be low.
Right.
Because if you're concerned, don't sit on it. That is, that's ultimately what we see in some of the presentations to our unit is people are like,
Right.
I hope it isn't really what it is. And if you're concerned, take it to the pediatrician, take it to the school counselors, take it to the teachers, take it to someone. Don't suffer quietly, don't suffer alone. If you're worried about your kid, don't suffer alone. It's really important.
So a lot of parents come to us and they say, well, I tried to get them into treatment, I tried to get them to talk to somebody, and they just didn't want to. They didn't want to talk to somebody.
Well, that's typical. And one, I've it's not infrequent that someone will say to me, well, we tried therapy, we went once.
Right. It didn't work.
It didn't work.
Yeah.
And now we don't like it.
Oh yeah, I hear that all the time. Yeah.
Well, it's like Chinese food. I mean, you go for Chinese food once and you don't like
yeah.
It doesn't mean that all Chinese food is
right.
bad.
Yeah. Well, maybe it does. But you're right. So what would you say to the parents what can we say to the parents to number one, get the kid in there, and number two, what would you say, 4 sessions before you could really tell whether it was an effective fit?
I think so. I think 4 is good. I typically recommend 4.
Yeah.
And it also depends on the nature of the problem, because some problems are more or less amenable to conventional approaches to treatment. So the good news about behavioral and psychiatric treatments is we've got more of them, and they're more evidence-based, and there's more and more reason to be convicted and clear that we have treatments for problems. Persistence is super important, and parental attitudes towards treatment are also incredibly important. When parents are devaluing of treatment, which is often the case, In part because I think parents feel that a need for treatment represents parental failure.
Totally, yes.
Which it isn't, because these are brain-based psychiatric illnesses that we don't entirely understand, but nonetheless they have neurological underpinnings which require intervention.
Right.
So parental attitude toward treatment is a big one. Okay, you don't like this therapist? Let's find you another. You don't like this program?
Right.
Let's do another. So that kind of dogged, persistent, diligent attitude from parents goes a long way. And there are certain kids who are better, more kind of intuitive therapy patients. But I teach my residents all the time, therapy cases are made.
Not born.
Not born. And a good psychotherapist isn't going to assume that a patient is going to be forthcoming about his or her problems.
Right.
And is going to start slowly and build an alliance and work towards a comfortable setting in which some of these problems can begin to be addressed.
Right. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about behaviors that become problematic.
Good.
Okay.
For 1 in 4 Americans, mental illness hits close to home. And since 1931, Silver Hill Hospital has also been close to home. For individuals and families facing the challenges of mental illness, Silver Hill offers a highly trained, compassionate staff that provides state-of-the-art care in a beautiful and private setting. If mental health issues hit close to home, remember, there's a world-class psychiatric hospital right in the neighborhood.
Welcome back to Straight Talk with Tracey. I'm joined today by Dr. Aaron Krasner of Silver Hill Hospital, and we're talking about knowing when your kid is all right. Again, thanks for being here.
It's so good to be with you.
So we're going to go on with our conversation and talk about problem behaviors. So some of the most common problem behaviors we see when we work with adolescents is drinking, using drugs, and self-harm. So how, again, drinking, experimenting with drugs, becoming sexually active, those are all, again, part of that normative spectrum of adolescence. When would those behaviors be considered problematic?
Well, the law stipulates that drinking and using drugs, let's use cannabis because cannabis is legal in certain places.
Marijuana,
right, yeah, is only legal over age 21. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the developing adolescent brain, as we've talked about in terms of its patchy myelination and its patchy development, is quite vulnerable. And the influence of different chemicals on brain function is not fully understood in the developing brain. But there are certain very clear indicators that early exposure to drugs and alcohol is a lifelong problem. And I believe it's for a couple of reasons. One reason is it's a lot easier to find a bottle of alcohol or marijuana than it is to find an empathic ear. And if people early find solace in chemical coping, it sets the brain up for an avoidant coping style that is enduring. And it sets the brain up in terms of the reward system to seek out drugs and alcohol, not only for reward, but also to manage the difficulties that present.
We're going to have an opportunity, you mentioned an empathic ear, we're going to have an opportunity in our next show to talk about communication, and so maybe we can touch on what it means to be empathic.
Yeah.
Right?
I think empathy is the healing balm. I mean, you and I work a lot with with empathy. It's very important. And even teaching, to the extent that you can, empathy to kids is important.
It's not as valued in our society these days as perhaps it used to be. That social emotional intelligence, or EQ, is not as valued as IQ anymore.
Well, it's a really good point. And I think that lower EQ leads to problem behaviors.
Exactly.
If we as a society don't necessarily value emotional intelligence, I don't really like emotional intelligence, emotional competence, then there aren't a lot of avenues to achieve it. It's not a class in school.
Right. Or an extracurricular.
It's not in the SAT.
Right.
Although I'm going to go on record here saying I think it should be. I think that there should be on the SAT an emotional component, because we're accepting into universities kids who have IQs through the roof and maybe coping styles that are extremely maladaptive.
Right. And then they're getting to these wonderful colleges that they've worked their whole life to get to, and then they crash and burn and they end up in our office.
They do, or worse.
Worse, right.
So these problem behaviors that you've alluded to, you've talked about drinking and drugging. Okay, so easier to find a chemical coper than an empathic ear.
Right, and heavy use of marijuana is considered 3 times a week.
Yes, heavy use is 3 times a week or daily, and the cannabis that's around now is more powerful than it was, in the 70s, early 80s. It's a different drug.
Right.
And alcohol, the typical pattern we see is binge drinking on the weekends,
right,
in where there are parties, etc.
Right. So I hear a lot from kids that they may be drinking a lot, but they know not to drive, so they won't get in a car. So they consider that safe drinking because they'll Uber home or they'll stay at the house where they're drinking. So they consider that safer drinking because they're not getting in a car. What would you say to that?
Well, it's better. I'd be so curious with those kids as to why they're drinking, and that's really a conversation that would be really terrific for parents to have with their kids. How come? Not, what are you doing? You're drinking again. But how come, man? What's going on that you? Well, everyone's drinking. It's the de rigueur thing.
Right.
If I don't drink, then well, okay, I get that, and I know how important it is to separate and be your own person. But what are the implications? And in some families, drinking is a nothing because no one drinks in the family. In some families, drinking is everything. Is everything, and we know from the literature that drinking has a high heritability estimate, meaning that if there are first-degree relatives who have alcohol problems, the likelihood of exposure to alcohol prompting an addictive process is higher.
Right.
So anyway, those are some problem behaviors that we see, the drinking and the drugging, and my strongest recommendation is to non-judgmentally try to understand what the significance is and see if it might be at all possible to get these kids some support, to get them the empathic ear, not the bottle of vodka.
Right. Good point.
You said something about self-harm.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned self-harm.
Which is not as normative. It's not on the, it is not a normative coping skill like drugs and alcohol could be considered, or even isolation. And it's more prominent today than ever.
Self-harm is on a continuum with suicide. And teen suicide, in particular in younger teens, is on the rise. And that's terrifying. You and I have treated families where there have been suicides in young people, and the ripple effect on the family and on the community is absolutely devastating. Self-harm is aggression turned inward, and Freud long ago talked about depression as anger turned inward. There's a lot of merit to that. We see it all the time. Kids are afraid of their own aggression. They wind up harming themselves. And it's a double-edged sword to harm yourself because, yes, you're harming yourself, and a lot of our kids will say they're bringing physical pain to the psychic pain.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it more tangible and real.
Right.
But self-harming is an interactive event. It involves the parents when they discern that it's happening, because it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's beyond the control of the parents. A lot of times suffering kids do stuff like that because it's within their control.
Right.
And they're trying, just like they're trying to chemically cope, they're coping in this way.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with self-injury is that it is definitively on a continuum with suicide and death. So what is a little bit of self-injury can become a lot of suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really scary.
Right.
But
often, parents don't know. So we hear a lot that, oh, the kid is just trying to get attention. But in fact, the kid may be self-harming for a year to 2 years before anyone becomes aware of it. So that it's not to get attention, it's rather to cope. Right. So when the parents may become aware, the kid might be far into that behavior.
Very far. And again, developing brains are patchy. So if the reward network in the brain is stimulated by a self-harm behavior, then the brain changes and codifies around this behavior, and it becomes progressively more difficult to stop and or treat.
Right.
So again, early detection is important, but it's awkward because, what are you going to do, body checks on your own kid?
Right.
I don't think so.
And often friends are the first to find out if a kid is self-harming, right? Peers will see it in the locker room or at a sleepover, or at school they'll see, blood on a sleeve or on a pair of pants or shorts. So that puts friends in a terrible position. When a friend finds out that that one of their friends is self-harming, what would a friend do? Because that as a whole.
Well, there's two things come to my mind. One is friends want to help. And there's something very powerful about teenage friendships as it pertains to suffering. They want to help each other. They want to be each other's therapists. The problem is they don't have degrees. And the level of problems that we're seeing in our teens right now is transcendent of what friends could possibly be capable of managing. And this harkens to the second point, and that is our communities are not as cohesive as perhaps they once were. And everyone is in a little silo. And the comfort of sharing vulnerability as families going through similar processes has been eroded by the enormous competition that has come to define upper middle class life. Mm-hmm. So you got friends hearing data on Snapchat about suicidal friends. Mm-hmm. And some parents are, let's say you got the suicidal kid communicating to the friend. Well, you would hope that the friend would be able to talk to his or her parents, and that his or her parents could then talk to the suicidal teen's parents in a helpful and collegial way. But that doesn't always happen.
No.
So friends are increasingly having to be creative and finding ways to be helpful to the suicidal teens. And technology has made this way more complicated, like a suicidal Facebook post, a suicidal Snapchat, which I think vanishes. That's what Snapchat is?
You're asking the wrong person. You're going to have to ask your kid.
You know, this is so scary for the teen friends. So the best resource in these situations probably is a school.
Right.
There's counselors at these schools.
And there's protocols in place.
Right. And you got to encourage these kids to take it to either the parents, their own parents for help and guidance, or the schools.
Right.
Or someone else who's trusted.
Right.
Who can intervene in a way that's not punitive.
Right. That's the key.
That's the key, because
then they go underground.
They go further underground. And we've seen that so many times. And that is these depressive, anxious kids who are enacting problematic behaviors are fearful that their only ways to cope with the vicissitudes of life are going to be taken from them.
That's right.
And then they'll really be left with nothing.
Right.
And so they cling, and understandably so.
Of course.
So the friends are really put in an awkward position. They want to help, they don't exactly know how, and my recommendation is to those kids, take it to someone who can help you.
Right. So that's the takeaway, is find someone who can be that empathic ear.
And literature tells us that kids who make it, despite massive vicissitudes, have a pillar. They have an adult or a mentor that helps them be resilient. And that's another huge takeaway. And that is, make sure your kid has a go-to.
Someone. Yeah, great. Thank you so much for joining me here today, Dr. Krasner, and thank you for joining me on Straight Talk with Tracey. Please join me again next month when we're going to be talking again with Dr. Krasner about communicating with your teen, the roller coasters and Ferris wheels of dealing with adolescents and parents.